Hey guys! Tonight we begin with 15 forgotten instant meals that kept ancient Chinese merchants alive on the Silk Road. Food you could make in under 10 minutes without crying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment, like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Let us begin with something that feels suspiciously modern: dried wheat noodles. Yes, long before instant ramen cups, before late-night dorm meals, before anyone argued about authentic broth, ancient Chinese merchants were already carrying the original version. No branding, no seasoning packet, no smiling cartoon mascot promising flavor adventure, just dried strands of wheat dough. The logic was simple. Fresh noodles spoil, spoiled noodles ruin morale. Ruined morale in the middle of the Taklamakan desert is not ideal for productivity, so they dried them completely. Moisture was the enemy. Moisture meant mold. Mold meant illness. Illness meant your camel gets promoted to carrying your goods and you do not. Once dried, the noodles became nearly indestructible, lightweight, stackable, calm under pressure. They sat quietly in saddlebags for weeks, minding their business while silk and jade took all the glory. And when the caravan stopped for the night, fires were lit, guards rotated, someone fetched water, a pot went on the flame, in went the noodles. A few minutes later, dinner existed. It was not fancy, no delicate plating, no hand-pulled theatrical performance in front of impressed traders. Just boiled wheat doing its job. And honestly, that is what makes it brilliant. Carbohydrates are portable energy. When you are crossing mountain passes at high altitude or negotiating trade deals in a language you barely understand, you need calories more than you need culinary innovation. No one on the Silk Road was reviewing noodle elasticity. They were thinking, does this keep me alive until tomorrow? Sometimes merchants added shaved jerky, sometimes a spoonful of fermented soybean paste, sometimes nothing at all, and even plain, it worked. There is something almost comforting about that simplicity. Add water, apply heat, avoid starvation. 2,000 years later, the formula has not changed much. We just upgraded the packaging and downgraded the patience. So the next time you slurp instant noodles and feel mildly unimpressed, remember, somewhere in ancient Central Asia, a tired merchant was doing the same thing, squatting by a fire, wind in his face, grateful for a bowl of boiled wheat. No plastic fork, no sodium warning label, just survival in a bowl. If dried noodles were the elegant solution, Bing flatbread was the blunt instrument. Dense, round, compact, often baked hard on purpose. Bing was not designed to impress anyone. It was designed to survive being crushed under silk bundles, shoved into saddlebags, and forgotten for several days without turning into a biology experiment. Soft bread is wonderful in theory. In reality, soft bread molds. And mold does not care that you are halfway across Central Asia. So merchants opted for durability. These flatbreads were typically made from wheat flour mixed with water, and sometimes animal fat or scallions. Then they were baked until firm, sometimes intentionally dry. Not because ancient cooks hated joy, but because moisture meant risk. A harder bread lasts longer. And when you are riding through heat during the day and freezing winds at night, you want something that does not emotionally collapse under temperature changes. Bing could be eaten as is, which meant chewing. A lot of chewing. Jaw strength was probably excellent among Silk Road traders. If water was available, the bread could be softened in broth. If tea was boiling, it could be dipped. If absolutely nothing else was around, it could be eaten dry while silently questioning your career choices. But it worked. It provided carbohydrates, bulk, and stability. It could be stacked flat, tied in cloth, and distributed easily among caravan members. There is something very practical about a food that doubles as both meal and structural support in your bag. Unlike noodles, which required boiling water, Bing required nothing. No pot, no fire, no patience, just teeth. And in uncertain territory, independence from equipment is powerful. Imagine sandstorms approaching, time limited. You cannot stop to cook. You reach into your bag, pull out a disc of bread, and continue walking. No ceremony, just survival calories. And while emperors dined on elaborate feasts in palace halls, the people actually moving goods across continents were chewing on dense wheat discs under open sky. Not glamorous, not delicate, but dependable. Sometimes civilization does not advance on flavor. It advances on foods that refuse to spoil. And Bing was exactly that, stubborn bread for stubborn journeys. Now, if noodles were comfort and Bing was stability, jerky was blunt force nutrition. Because at some point on a long journey, you need protein. And protein does not politely wait for ideal cooking conditions. Fresh meat spoils quickly, especially when you are crossing deserts where the sun seems personally offended by your existence. So merchants turned to one of humanity's oldest preservation tricks: salt and air. Beef or mutton was sliced thin, salted aggressively, and I do mean aggressively, and then hung to dry in wind and sun. Over time, moisture evaporated, bacteria gave up, and what remained was dense, leathery survival fuel. Was it tender? No. Was it flavorful? Also no, unless you consider intense salt a flavor profile. Was it effective? Absolutely. Jerky required zero preparation, no boiling water, no grinding grain, no fermentation schedule. You pulled a strip from your pack and chewed, and chewed, and kept chewing. It likely took longer to eat than to prepare, but that was part of its advantage. The slow chew meant slow consumption. It stretched your ration. It kept your mouth busy while walking through endless stretches of sand and scrubland. Also, let us be honest, jaw strength among Silk Road merchants must have been impressive. Jerky was light relative to fresh meat and packed high energy density. A small bundle could sustain you for hours of travel. In environments where fires were risky or fuel scarce, jerky became essential. There is also something psychologically grounding about meat on a long journey. It signals strength. It signals substance. It reminds you that you are not surviving on grain alone. And importantly, jerky did not care about politics. Borders shifted. Dynasties rose and fell. Trade tariffs changed. Jerky remained stable. You could negotiate silk prices by day and gnaw on salted mutton by night. Not glamorous, not romantic, but functional. If dried noodles were the ancestor of instant ramen, jerky was the ancestor of every protein bar that promises strength, endurance, and questionable texture. The difference is that ancient merchants did not pretend it was gourmet. They knew exactly what it was. Fuel. Tough, salty, dependable fuel. And sometimes, that is all you need to keep walking. If jerky was protein discipline, compressed rice cakes were carbohydrate engineering. Rice, unlike wheat, does not naturally travel well once cooked. It is soft, moist, pleasant, which are three qualities that desserts immediately punish. So merchants adapted. Cooked rice was pressed tightly into dense cakes, compact, firm, and intentionally dried. By removing excess moisture and compressing the grains together, they created something stackable, transportable, and far less likely to spoil. Think of it as ancient vacuum sealing. The result was not fluffy. It was not delicate. It was not the kind of rice served in porcelain bowls in court banquets. It was brick rice, dense enough to survive a week in a saddlebag, sturdy enough to endure temperature swings, calm under pressure, unlike the humans carrying it. When it was time to eat, merchants would soak the rice cakes in hot water or broth. The grains would slowly soften and separate, returning, at least partially, to their former edible dignity. If no water was available, you chewed carefully and reflected on life choices. But when rehydrated properly, rice cakes became comforting, familiar, grounding. And that familiarity mattered. Because long-distance trade is not just physically exhausting, it is mentally draining. You are far from home, navigating unfamiliar languages and customs. A bowl of rice, even slightly stubborn rice, reconnects you to something stable. Rice also carries symbolic weight in Chinese culture. It represents sustenance, community, continuity. So pressing it into portable form was not just practical, it was cultural resilience. There is something deeply human about taking your most familiar food and reshaping it for survival. The Silk Road demanded flexibility, adaptation, efficiency. Compressed rice cakes delivered all three. They packed neatly, distributed evenly, stored easily. And unlike elaborate dishes requiring fresh ingredients, rice cakes did not demand perfection. They demanded water, which admittedly was sometimes its own adventure. Still, in a world without refrigeration, plastic containers, or vacuum-sealed pouches, merchants managed to create something astonishingly modern: portable rice that could wait. Patient, unassuming, and ready to return to life with a little heat. Not elegant, but effective. And on the Silk Road, effective was everything. Now let's talk about the quiet hero of ancient grains: millet. Not glamorous, not celebrated in poetry, rarely the star of a banquet. But if you wanted to survive unpredictable terrain, temperature swings, and long stretches without reliable water, millet was your loyal companion. Unlike rice, which demands flooded fields and careful cultivation, millet is stubborn. It grows in poor soil. It tolerates drought. It does not complain, which makes it ideal for harsh climates. Before setting out, merchants would roast millet grains in advance. Roasting removed moisture and slightly hardened the grain, extending its shelf life dramatically. Once roasted, millet became travel-friendly, lightweight, durable, resistant to spoilage. When camp was set and water boiled, you could pour hot water over the roasted millet and wait. It softened relatively quickly, forming a thick porridge. Not exciting, but filling. And when you are walking or riding for hours under open sky, filling is what matters. There is something deeply reassuring about a grain that requires almost nothing from you. No elaborate cooking method, no delicate handling, just heat and patience. And patience was abundant on caravan routes. Roasted millet also had another advantage. It was easy to portion, a handful per person, measured without scales or mathematics. Fair distribution keeps peace inside the caravan, because while outside threats were dangerous, internal disputes over food were arguably worse. Imagine crossing the desert with someone who feels cheated on millet rations. Not ideal. Millet porridge may not have tasted like luxury, but it delivered steady energy, slow-burning fuel for long days. It was the kind of food that did not distract you. It did not overwhelm your senses. It simply supported your survival, and that is perhaps its greatest achievement. In modern times, we chase variety and novelty. Ancient merchants chased reliability. Millet delivered reliability. In a world where weather could turn violent, trade routes could close suddenly, and bandits could appear without invitation, there was comfort in knowing your grain would not betray you. Roasted millet did not seek applause. It sought continuity. And sometimes continuity is the most valuable commodity on the Silk Road. Now we move from survival calories to survival flavor. Because let's be honest, boiled millet, dried bread, and plain noodles will keep you alive. But they will not keep you enthusiastic. Enter fermented soybean paste, thick, salty, powerful in aroma. Stored in small clay jars and carried carefully among supplies, this paste was the ancient answer to culinary boredom. Soybeans were fermented with salt and thyme, two ingredients that rarely fail. Over weeks or months, microbes did their invisible work, breaking down proteins and creating deep, savory flavor. Merchants did not know the word umami, but they definitely experienced it. A spoonful stirred into boiling noodles could transform bland wheat into something resembling a meal. Mixed into millet porridge, it added depth. Spread thinly on Bing bread, it made chewing more meaningful. Flavor matters, especially when your surroundings are dust, wind, and uncertainty. Fermented paste also served another crucial purpose: salt. Salt preserves. Salt replenishes electrolytes lost through sweat, and if you are crossing arid landscapes under relentless sun, you are sweating whether you enjoy it or not. So this paste was not just taste enhancement, it was mineral insurance. Of course, there was one small issue: the smell. Fermentation is honest. It does not disguise itself. A jar of soybean paste likely carried a strong aroma that announced its presence to the entire caravan. But when your alternative is plain boiled grain, you develop appreciation. And here is something important. Fermented foods travel well. They are already preserved, already transformed, already stable. Unlike fresh vegetables or fresh meat, fermented paste could sit patiently in its jar for weeks. It did not demand constant attention. It waited. There is something almost philosophical about that. In a world defined by movement, caravans advancing, trade shifting, seasons changing, this small jar represented controlled time, slow transformation, stability within motion. And when night fell and a caravan gathered around a modest fire, a spoon of fermented paste stirred into a pot could make the difference between mere survival and mild satisfaction. Not gourmet, not delicate, but deeply effective. Sometimes civilization advances on grand inventions, and sometimes it advances on fermented soybeans quietly doing their job in a clay jar, which, honestly, might be more impressive. Now let's talk about something that sounds surprisingly modern for a caravan crossing Central Asia: dried tofu sheets. Yes, tofu was not just soft white cubes floating politely in broth. It could also be pressed thin, stretched into sheets, and fully dried for travel. And once dried, it became a masterpiece of efficiency. Tofu begins as soy milk. Soy milk becomes curds. Curds are pressed. But if you press them further and remove nearly all moisture, you get something light, durable, and highly portable. Moisture is the enemy of travel. Dryness is security. Dried tofu sheets weighed very little. They could be folded neatly, stacked, and tucked between bundles of fabric without taking up precious space. And unlike meat, they did not spoil quickly. Plant protein, stabilized. When it was time to eat, merchants would drop the sheets into hot water or broth. Slowly they softened. They expanded. They returned to something resembling fresh tofu. Not exactly the same, but close enough. There is something deeply practical about that transformation. A food that looks unimpressive when dry, but revives itself with heat. It is almost poetic. Also, tofu sheets required no chewing marathons like jerky, no aggressive jaw workout, just patience. And for long journeys, patience is abundant. Tofu also offered balance. A diet of mostly grains and salted meat can feel heavy. Dried tofu brought variety, mild in flavour, but adaptable. It absorbed whatever broth or paste it touched, which made it an excellent companion to fermented soybean paste from the previous chapter. See? Culinary continuity. There is also a broader story here. Soy products were deeply embedded in Chinese cuisine and culture. Carrying tofu, even in dried form, was not just about nutrition. It was about familiarity, about bringing a piece of home onto uncertain roads. On the Silk Road, merchants encountered foreign foods, cheeses, dried fruits, spices from distant lands. But they also carried what they trusted. Dried tofu sheets represent that trust. Not dramatic, not flashy, but reliable. And when you are negotiating trade in unfamiliar cities, crossing deserts where water is rationed carefully, and sleeping under unpredictable skies, reliability is a luxury, soft when needed, stable when required. A surprisingly elegant solution to a very unglamorous problem: how to pack protein without packing risk. At this point, the caravan diet is looking respectable. Grains, protein, fermented paste, tofu sheets. But something is missing. Crunch, enter pickled vegetables, cabbage, radish, mustard greens, sometimes cucumbers if conditions allowed. These were submerged in brine or fermented in sealed jars long before departure. Salt did the preserving. Microbes did the rest. And what came out was tangy, sharp, aggressively alive food that refused to spoil easily. Pickling solved multiple problems at once. First, preservation. Fresh vegetables are wonderful for approximately 3 days on the Silk Road. After that, they become regret. Salted vegetables, however, could last weeks, sometimes months. Second, nutrition. Even if merchants did not understand vitamins in scientific terms, they understood that eating only dried grains and salted meat eventually made you feel not great. Pickled vegetables provided balance, freshness, or at least the illusion of freshness. Third, morale. A bite of sour radish after days of bland porridge can feel like a revelation. It wakes up your mouth. It reminds you that flavour exists, and flavour, on long journeys, matters more than we admit. There is also something delightfully practical about fermentation. It requires time before the journey, but almost no effort during it. Once sealed, the vegetables quietly preserve themselves. No daily maintenance, no constant supervision, just a jar sitting patiently among trade goods. Of course, there were risks. Jars could crack, brine could spill, and if you opened one at the wrong moment, the scent might announce your location to everyone within 10 meters, but that was a small price for texture. Imagine a caravan gathering at dusk, wind calming, fires lit, noodles boiling. Someone opens a jar. The sharp aroma cuts through the desert air. It is not subtle, but it is comforting. Pickled vegetables were not glamorous trade items like silk or porcelain. They were practical insurance against dietary monotony. And in an environment where monotony could become mentally exhausting, even small bursts of sour crunch had value. Because survival is not only about calories, it is about keeping your senses awake. And a well-timed bite of pickled cabbage can do exactly that. Simple, sharp, preserved by salt and patience. Ancient proof that even on the longest roads, humans crave something crisp. Now we move from sour crunch to concentrated sweetness. Sesame honey bars were the ancient Silk Road version of an energy bar, except they did not come wrapped in plastic or claim to improve your focus. They were simple, ground sesame seeds mixed with honey, pressed tightly into dense blocks, and left to set. That was it. Sesame seeds are small but powerful. Packed with fats and nutrients, they deliver long-lasting energy. Honey adds natural sugars, quick fuel when your legs feel like they have been negotiating trade deals all day. Pressed together, the mixture became compact, portable, resistant to crumbling, perfect for long stretches where stopping to cook was inconvenient. You could eat a small square and feel the immediate lift. Not a dramatic sugar rush, just steady energy. And unlike dried bread or jerky, sesame honey bars required no fire, no boiling water, no preparation. Just unwrap from cloth and bite. There is something beautifully efficient about that. On a windswept plateau or a narrow mountain pass, when the caravan needed to keep moving, these bars offered fuel without interruption. They were also psychologically important. Sweetness is comforting. It signals abundance. It reminds you of festivals, home kitchens, celebrations. Even a small taste of honey in the middle of a harsh journey softens the experience. Of course, there were trade-offs. In extreme heat, honey softens. In cold conditions, it hardens like stone. So merchants had to time their bites carefully. But still, the concept was brilliant. Fat plus sugar equals endurance. Centuries before modern nutrition science, Silk Road merchants understood something fundamental. Long journeys required dense, portable energy, and sesame honey bars delivered exactly that. They were not luxury desserts. They were strategic sweetness, a small block that could be rationed carefully, shared easily, and stored without complicated preservation methods. In a world defined by sandstorms and negotiation, a compact square of sesame and honey represented controlled energy. Not dramatic, not ornate. Just a reminder that sometimes the simplest combinations, seed and sweetness, are enough to keep you walking toward the next horizon. And honestly, that might be the most timeless snack formula of all. Now let's talk about something that was technically a drink, but functioned very much like a meal: tea bricks. Instead of loose leaves floating politely in a porcelain pot, Silk Road merchants carried compressed blocks of tea, tightly packed leaves pressed into dense rectangular bricks. Why bricks? Because loose leaves spill. Loose leaves scatter. Loose leaves make a mess inside saddlebags full of valuable textiles. Bricks stack neatly. Bricks travel well. Bricks look suspiciously like currency, which, conveniently, they sometimes were. Tea bricks were durable and easy to portion. You simply chipped off a small piece, dropped it into boiling water, and let it steep. Instant warmth. Instant alertness. Instant morale. And morale on a months-long trade route is not a minor detail. Tea was not only about hydration, it was about ritual. Even in the harshest landscapes, boiling water for tea created structure, a pause, a moment of normalcy. The caravan might be surrounded by wind-blown sand or perched on a cold mountain pass, but the act of preparing tea remained the same. Boil, steep, pour. There is comfort in repetition. Tea also served practical purposes. Boiling water kills pathogens. In uncertain regions where water sources could not always be trusted, tea was a safer alternative than drinking directly from a stream. So it was both beverage and protective measure. And then there is the stimulant effect. Long days of riding, walking, negotiating, and guarding require focus. Tea sharpened the mind without the jittery unpredictability of something stronger. Merchants needed steady thinking, not wild energy spikes. Tea bricks delivered consistency. They were compact, valuable, and versatile. Sometimes traded, sometimes consumed, sometimes gifted to local officials as part of diplomatic courtesy. Imagine that. Your snack doubles as legal tender. In a way, tea bricks represent something larger about the Silk Road. Food was not separate from trade, it was trade. And sometimes the most important instant meal was not something chewed, but something sipped slowly while watching the sun set over endless terrain. Not flashy, not loud, just steam rising into cold air. Ancient proof that sometimes survival comes in a cup. Now we arrive at something dangerously close to comfort food. Dumplings. Yes, even on the Silk Road, the craving for small pockets of dough filled with something edible did not disappear. It simply adapted. Fresh dumplings are wonderful. Soft wrappers, juicy fillings, steam rising gently from a bamboo basket. Fresh dumplings are also completely impractical for a multi-month caravan journey. So merchants did what humans always do when faced with impractical luxury. They modified it. Some dumplings were partially cooked, steamed or boiled just enough to set their shape, and then dried thoroughly for travel. Removing moisture extended their shelf life significantly. What remained were compact, firm dumplings that could survive the inside of a saddlebag without dissolving into tragedy. Were they delicate? No. Were they elegant? Also no. But they carried something priceless: familiarity. When the caravan stopped for the night and water boiled over a small fire, dried dumplings could be dropped into the pot. Slowly, they softened. The wrapper relaxed. The filling rehydrated. It was not the same as fresh, but it was close enough to feel like home. And that emotional component matters, because long-distance trade is not just physically exhausting, it is psychologically draining. You are far from family, far from routine, surrounded by unfamiliar languages and landscapes. A dumpling, even a stubborn, travel-worn dumpling, reconnects you to something stable. From a nutritional standpoint, dumplings were efficient. Dough provided carbohydrates. Fillings, often minced meat or vegetables, added protein and flavor. Compact packaging meant portion control was easy. One handful per person. No arguments. Ideally. Of course, dried dumplings required fuel and water to revive properly. You could not simply chew them dry unless you were particularly committed to self-inflicted suffering. But when prepared correctly, they transformed a cold, uncertain evening into something warmer, and that transformation is key. The Silk Road was a corridor of exchange, goods, ideas, languages. But within the caravan, some things remained unchanged, like the instinct to wrap food in dough and call it comfort, not glamorous, not ornate, but deeply human. And sometimes, that is the most nourishing ingredient of all. Now we move to something bold, salted duck eggs, not subtle, not mild, not shy about announcing their presence. Duck eggs were preserved in brine or coated in salted clay and stored for weeks before travel. Over time, the salt penetrated the shell, transforming the interior into something firm, intensely savoury, and remarkably long-lasting. In a world without refrigeration, that is culinary wizardry. Eggs are fragile. They break. They spoil. They are the opposite of travel-friendly, unless you salt them aggressively. Once preserved, salted duck eggs became compact protein bombs. Dense yolks, salty whites. Shelf life extended dramatically. You did not need fire. You did not need water. You simply cracked the shell and ate. Immediate nourishment. Immediate intensity. Salted duck eggs also solved another problem: sodium loss. Long days under sun, walking or riding, meant constant sweating. Salt replenishment was not optional. These eggs delivered it generously, perhaps even enthusiastically. Flavor-wise, they were unapologetic. One bite and you knew exactly what you were dealing with. No gentle introduction, no subtle notes. But when your daily diet consists of grains and dried foods, bold flavor becomes welcome. They were also compact and easy to ration. 1 egg per person, clean division, no slicing required. Of course, there was risk. Eggs are fragile by nature. Caravan movement is not gentle. Careful packing was essential. Imagine losing your protein supply because a camel stumbled. Not ideal. Still, salted duck eggs offered something unique: portability without preparation. They were self-contained meals. Crack. Eat. Continue walking. And there is something almost poetic about that simplicity. In palace kitchens, eggs might be whipped, folded and seasoned delicately. On the Silk Road, they were salted and hardened for endurance. Different context, different priorities, same ingredient. Salted duck eggs represent the Silk Road's philosophy in miniature. Take something fragile and make it resilient. Preserve it, harden it, prepare it for movement. Because on long journeys, survival favours foods that can handle a little pressure, and salted duck eggs handled pressure very well. Now here is where the Silk Road becomes truly interesting, because not every instant meal was originally Chinese. As caravans moved westward into Central Asia, merchants encountered something that was not common in traditional Han Chinese diets: hard cheese. Nomadic pastoralists across Central Asia had mastered dairy preservation. Fresh milk spoils quickly, but fermented and hardened milk, that can travel. So through trade and exposure, Chinese merchants began incorporating hardened cheeses into their provisions. These were not soft, creamy cheeses. They were firm, dense, sometimes extremely dry. Made from sheep, goat, or cow milk, these cheeses were pressed and aged until most moisture disappeared. The result was a compact, protein-rich block that could survive heat, time, and long-distance movement. Sound familiar? That is because survival cuisine tends to converge on similar solutions. Hard cheese required no cooking, no preparation, just slicing or breaking, depending on how determined you felt. It provided fat, protein, and minerals. In a diet dominated by grains, that balance mattered. There is also something culturally fascinating here. The Silk Road was not just about exporting silk or importing spices. It was about culinary exchange. Ideas about preservation travelled alongside textiles and ceramics. A merchant who began his journey eating noodles and millet might, weeks later, be chewing on Central Asian cheese under an open sky. That is not just trade. That is adaptation. Of course, cheese was an acquired taste for some. Fermented dairy can be assertive, but hunger is an excellent motivator for open-mindedness, and practicality overrides preference. Hard cheese also had another advantage: durability in cold climates. Mountain passes could be freezing. Unlike fresh foods, hardened cheese remained stable. You could eat it with flatbread, pair it with dried fruit, combine it with nuts. Suddenly your caravan dinner feels almost cosmopolitan. There is something poetic about that moment. On a trade route connecting east and west, your snack becomes a symbol of exchange. Grain from one region, dairy from another, shared around a fire, not formal diplomacy. Just food doing what food does best, crossing borders quietly. Hard cheese on the Silk Road was not exotic luxury. It was nutritional diplomacy. Firm, durable, slightly surprising, and proof that even in harsh landscapes, culture travels through taste. By now, the caravan diet is looking impressively functional. Grains for energy, protein from jerky and eggs, fermented paste for flavor, cheese for cross-cultural nutrition. But sometimes you need something that requires absolutely nothing. No fire, no boiling water, no clay jar, no negotiation. Just reach into your bag and eat. Enter the nut and date mix. From oasis towns scattered along the Silk Road came almonds, walnuts, pistachios, and, perhaps most importantly, dates. These small desert fruits were nature's survival packages, high in natural sugar, compact, long-lasting, and surprisingly resilient to heat. Nuts added fat and protein. Dates added sweetness and quick energy. Together they formed something astonishingly modern. Ancient trail mix. No resealable pouch. No branding about heart-healthy ingredients. Just dense calories in handful form. And that handful mattered, because caravans did not always move in predictable stages. Sometimes you had long stretches without proper rest stops. Sometimes you needed fuel while still riding or walking. You could not stop and boil millet every time you felt slightly hungry. You reached into your pouch and grabbed a few nuts and a date. Chew, walk, continue. It was the perfect in-motion food. There is also something deeply Silk Road about this mix. Nuts from one region, dates from another, combined in a trader's hand somewhere between civilizations. It represents what the trade network truly was, blending cultures quietly, one snack at a time. And unlike some preserved foods, nuts and dates did not require acclimation. They were universally appreciated. Sweetness is cross-cultural. Fat is cross-cultural. No diplomatic interpreter required. Of course, rationing was important. High-energy foods disappear quickly if eaten carelessly. Discipline kept the caravan stable. But in moments of fatigue, climbing a pass, crossing wind-blasted sand, a small handful of nut and date mix could feel transformative. Quick energy, natural sugar, portable morale. Not dramatic, not ceremonial, just reliable. And perhaps that is the theme emerging here. The Silk Road was not sustained by grand feasts. It was sustained by small, dense, dependable foods that asked almost nothing from their environment. Grab, eat, keep moving. Sometimes survival is as simple as that. We end with something that feels almost suspiciously advanced. Bone broth concentrate. Yes. Long before powdered soup packets and bouillon cubes, Silk Road merchants were already reducing animal bones into portable flavour bricks. The method was simple, but brilliant. Bones from cattle, sheep or goats were boiled for hours, sometimes days, extracting nutrients, fat, collagen and minerals into a rich broth. Then that broth was reduced down further and further until it thickened into a dense, almost gelatinous concentrate. In colder climates, it hardened naturally. In warmer regions, it could be dried further or stored in sealed containers. The result? A compact, intensely flavorful block that required only one thing to become dinner: hot water. Drop a piece into boiling water and suddenly the caravan had soup. Warm, salty, comforting, and warmth on a mountain pass at night is not optional. Bone broth concentrate solved several problems at once. It delivered nutrients that dried grains could not provide. It restored salts lost through sweat. It softened hard bread and noodles when poured over them. It turned survival rations into something almost civilized. There is something deeply psychological about soup. It signals care. It signals stability. It signals that someone thought ahead. Imagine a cold evening after weeks on the road. Wind sharp, muscles sore. A pot of water boils. Someone drops in a piece of concentrated broth. The smell rises slowly into the dark. That scent alone might be enough to steady morale. And unlike fresh meat, broth concentrate travelled well. It was lighter than carrying full cuts of meat. It wasted nothing. Bones, often discarded, became nourishment. Efficiency at its finest. What makes this even more remarkable is how modern it feels. Add water, stir, eat. The same formula we still use. In the end, that may be the greatest lesson of Silk Road instant meals. Civilization did not advance only through silk and trade agreements. It advanced through clever preservation, through reducing complexity into portability, through transforming fragile ingredients into resilient forms, and bone broth concentrate might be the perfect symbol of that philosophy. Take something ordinary, refine it, harden it, make it ready for movement. Because on the longest roads in history, the most important invention was not luxury, it was practicality in edible form. Before the frontier had banks, newspapers, or anything resembling public order, it had saloons. You could always find one. Just follow the noise. A piano being assaulted in the corner. Laughter that sounded half joyful, half unhinged. Boots thudding against wooden floors that had not seen water in a meaningful way since the building was constructed. And of course, the swinging doors, dramatic, theatrical, and absolutely committed to making every entrance feel like the beginning of a duel. Push through those doors and the smell hits you first. Whiskey, sweat, tobacco smoke thick enough to chew. The sawdust on the floor wasn't decorative. It absorbed spilled drinks, tobacco spit, and occasionally blood. Think of it as the West's version of a cleaning system. Primitive, efficient, and morally indifferent. The bar itself was the altar. Thick wood scarred by knives, coins, and fists. Behind it stood the bartender, part businessman, part referee, part crisis manager. He poured drinks, extended credit, broke up fights, and remembered who owed what. In a town where memory was currency, he was rich. Miners arrived with gold dust tucked into pouches, eager to convert weeks of backbreaking labour into 10 minutes of reckless celebration. Cowboys rode in stiff from the trail, looking for whiskey strong enough to erase dust and loneliness. Lawmen stood awkwardly at the bar, pretending they were off duty while keeping one eye on the room. And in the corner, always, a poker table, quiet, tense, more dangerous than any gunfight. Saloons were social hubs because there was nowhere else to go. No cinemas, no organised sports leagues, no polite dinner parties. If you wanted news, you came to the saloon. If you wanted work, you asked around at the saloon. If you wanted trouble, you would absolutely find it in the saloon. It was civilization stripped to its essentials. Drink, gamble, negotiate, argue, repeat. Deals were sealed with handshakes and whiskey. Grudges simmered under cigar smoke. Friendships were formed at midnight and broken by sunrise. The frontier was harsh, unpredictable, and lonely. The saloon offered heat, noise, and human company. It was messy, loud, and often violent, but for many, it was the closest thing the Wild West had to a living room. If the saloon was the heart of frontier life, whiskey was the blood pumping through it. This was not the refined amber liquid resting peacefully in crystal decanters. Frontier whiskey was aggressive. It burned going down, reconsidered its life choices halfway through your throat, and then set up permanent residence in your stomach like it owned property there. It went by many names. Red-eye, firewater, busthead, none of them comforting. Most saloon whiskey was not aged in oak barrels for years while someone contemplated poetry. It was often raw, hastily distilled, and occasionally improved, with additives that would concern a modern health inspector. Tobacco spit for colour, burnt sugar for flavour, sometimes even a dash of kerosene for what can only be described as enthusiasm. Yet men lined up for it. Why? Because the frontier was exhausting. You woke up early. You worked hard. You risked being kicked by livestock, crushed by mining equipment, or shot by someone who misunderstood a joke. By sundown, a glass of something flammable felt earned. A shot cost a few cents, cheap enough for a labourer, strong enough to erase regret. Saloons didn't encourage sipping. This was not a tasting event. You threw it back, winced, coughed once to prove you were still alive, and nodded like you had just conquered something meaningful. The bartender rarely asked questions. He simply poured. Whiskey fueled everything inside those walls. It loosened tongues and tightened tempers. It turned minor disagreements into philosophical debates and philosophical debates into fistfights. It also fueled generosity. A miner who struck gold might buy drinks for the entire room, transforming strangers into temporary brothers. And then there were the rituals. A man entering town after months on the trail might order a drink before even greeting anyone. A handshake was good. A shared bottle was better. Trust was measured in refills. Of course, not everyone handled it well. Some drank to celebrate, others drank to forget. The saloon didn't judge. It just refilled the glass. In a place where tomorrow was uncertain and survival was never guaranteed, whiskey offered one simple promise. For a few hours, the world would feel warmer, louder, and slightly less dangerous, even if the morning proved otherwise. If whiskey was loud and chaotic, the poker table was quiet and deadly. Tucked slightly away from the bar, under a hanging lamp that flickered with questionable commitment, sat the real engine of tension inside any saloon. Here, voices lowered. Laughter faded. Boots stopped stomping. Even the piano seemed to soften, as if it understood that money was about to change hands. Poker was not just a game. It was a test of nerve, deception, and how well you could keep your face from revealing that you were holding absolutely nothing. Miners came in with gold dust tied in little leather pouches. Cowboys laid down crumpled bills earned from long cattle drives. Travellers put up coins, watches, sometimes even horses. The stakes could escalate quickly. One good hand could mean a week of luxury. One bad one could mean walking home. The dealer, usually one of the players or a hired man with steady hands, shuffled the deck with deliberate calm. Cards slapped the table. Chips scraped across wood. Spittoons clinked quietly as someone leaned back to think. Every movement felt amplified. Bluffing was an art form. A man might stare down his opponent as if he held the winning hand of the century, when in reality he was relying entirely on confidence and the hope that the other fellow blinked first. And often that was enough. But poker tables carried more than tension. They carried suspicion. In towns where reputations were fragile, being accused of cheating was dangerous. A hidden card, a suspicious shuffle, or a glance exchanged with the wrong person could ignite something far more serious than an argument. Sometimes it ended with chairs scraping back violently, sometimes with fists, and occasionally with a man reaching for the revolver resting on the table beside his chips. Yet, people kept playing, because poker offered something rare on the frontier, the illusion of control. Out on the plains or in the mines, nature dictated your fate. At the poker table, you could at least pretend it was strategy, not luck, deciding your future. Inside that circle of smoke and lamplight, fortunes were made, lost, and occasionally avenged, all without raising your voice. No saloon was complete without music. Somewhere near the wall, slightly elevated if the owner was feeling ambitious, stood the piano. It was rarely tuned. It had survived dust storms, drunken elbows, and at least one fistfight that ended on top of it. Yet every evening, someone sat down and brought it to life. Enter the piano girl. She was part entertainer, part survival strategist. Dressed brighter than the rest of the room, she played lively tunes that drowned out arguments and encouraged boots to stomp in rhythm instead of anger. Her job was simple in theory: keep the mood light, keep the drinks flowing, and keep the men distracted. Music in a saloon wasn't background noise. It was crowd control. Fast tempos meant celebration. Slow ballads meant nostalgia. A sudden dramatic chord could silence a room faster than a shouted threat. The piano girl understood her audience. She could read the shift in energy before anyone else. When tempers flared, she played louder. When gold dust hit the bar in celebration, she sped things up. And then there were the so-called dance hall girls. Often misunderstood and frequently judged, these women worked the floor with calculated charm. They laughed at jokes they had heard 100 times. They accepted drinks they rarely finished. They sold companionship in small, socially acceptable portions: a dance, a conversation, a smile that lingered just long enough to encourage another round. The saloon depended on them. Their presence kept men spending money. It softened the harshness of frontier life. A cowboy who had not spoken to a woman in weeks might suddenly remember how to stand up straight. A miner covered in dust might attempt something resembling manners. Of course, life for these women was not glamorous. The same crowd that applauded their songs could turn unpredictable. Protection was often informal: an understanding with the bartender, a warning glance from a regular patron, sometimes a shotgun kept behind the bar. Still, night after night, the piano played. In a world defined by rough edges and hard labour, the music offered something softer. For a few hours, under smoky lamps and flickering candles, the saloon became less about survival and more about performance, a stage where everyone played a part. If you wanted elegance, you were in the wrong building. A frontier saloon was not concerned with refinement. It was concerned with function. And nowhere was that more obvious than in the spittoons. Strategically placed across the floor like small metal landmines, these brass or iron containers existed for one reason: tobacco. Chewing tobacco was everywhere. Men packed it into their cheeks, worked it thoughtfully like they were solving complex philosophical problems, and then leaned back to spit with impressive confidence. Accuracy, however, was optional. Some men prided themselves on hitting the spittoon cleanly from a respectable distance. Others contributed more broadly to the sawdust ecosystem. The metallic ping of a successful shot could earn approving nods. A miss might earn laughter. Either way, the ritual continued. Add to that the smoke: cigars, pipes, hand-rolled cigarettes. The air was thick enough to sculpt. By midnight, visibility inside some saloons rivaled a foggy battlefield. Conversations floated in clouds of grey. Eyes stung. No one complained. This was normal. The smell was a layered masterpiece: whiskey, sweat, leather, tobacco, gun oil, and occasionally cheap perfume. Windows, when present, were rarely opened. Fresh air was considered optional. Warmth and noise were not. Chairs creaked under the weight of exhausted men. Boots rested on tables. Hats remained firmly on heads indoors, because frontier etiquette was flexible at best. Laughter erupted suddenly, often over jokes that were either brilliant or deeply questionable. And yet there was structure within the chaos. Regulars had their spots. Certain tables belonged to certain groups. The bar's far corner might host ranch hands. Near the entrance stood travellers. In the back, quieter but watchful, sat the men who preferred to observe before engaging. The saloon was messy, loud, and unapologetically rough, but it worked. It gave structure to towns that had very little of it. It offered routine in places where nothing else felt stable. Civilization on the frontier was not polished marble and polite conversation. It was sawdust floors and shared smoke. It was spittoons ringing like tiny bells of questionable hygiene. And for the men inside, that was more than enough. While whiskey burned and cards shuffled, the real business of the frontier often happened quietly, in the corner booth, away from the piano and just out of reach of flying chairs. Saloons were where contracts were born. There were no polished boardrooms, no legal teams in pressed suits. Instead, deals were sealed with a handshake, a nod, and sometimes a second glass to make it official. Cattle drives were organised over sticky tabletops. Mining partnerships were formed between men who had known each other for exactly 20 minutes. Land was bought and sold based on rumours, optimism, and occasionally outright fantasy. The saloon provided what the frontier lacked: witnesses. When two men agreed on something at a table surrounded by regulars, the entire room became an informal legal system. If someone broke their word, everyone would know. Reputation travelled faster than a horse on open plains. Cattle barons leaned over maps drawn on napkins. Prospectors spread out crude sketches of hills that allegedly glittered with opportunity. Ranchers negotiated wages with trail hands who were still nursing last night's headache. The bartender overheard everything and forgot nothing. Sometimes the deals were legitimate. Sometimes they were spectacularly misguided. A man might sell rights to land he had never actually visited. Another might invest his savings in a silver claim that turned out to be more optimism than ore. But in the moment, under lamplight and thick air, every agreement felt grand. There was something about the noise of a saloon that made risk seem smaller. Surrounded by laughter and music, it was easy to believe the future would cooperate. The room hummed with possibility. Money changed hands. Promises were made confidently, and occasionally, very occasionally, those promises held. Of course, not all negotiations ended peacefully. A disputed claim or unpaid debt could quickly shift from polite discussion to raised voices. The same table that hosted friendly agreements might later host accusations. Still, night after night, men gathered in those corners, because the frontier rewarded boldness. And nowhere felt bolder than a saloon, where fortunes were gambled not just with cards, but with words. In theory, the saloon was neutral ground. In practice, it was where lawmen and outlaws stood 5 feet apart, pretending not to notice each other. The town sheriff usually arrived early in the evening. He would take up a position near the bar, not quite relaxed, not quite alert, sipping slowly and scanning the room without appearing to do so. His badge might be pinned proudly to his vest, or casually half hidden beneath it, depending on how tense the week had been. Across the room, perhaps leaning back in a chair with boots propped on a table, sat the man he had been looking for all month. But this was the frontier. Arrests were inconvenient, backup was unreliable, and everyone needed a drink. Saloons created strange moments of coexistence. A wanted man could play cards with the deputy's cousin. A bounty hunter might share a table with the very outlaw whose poster hung outside. The piano played on, as if unaware that the room contained enough firepower to start a small war. Sometimes nothing happened. Men drank. They nodded. They ignored the tension hanging between them like a low storm cloud. The unspoken agreement was simple. Not tonight. Other times it took very little. A careless insult, a misheard comment, a reminder of unpaid debts or old grudges. Whiskey had a way of dissolving patience. Hands drifted toward holsters almost subconsciously. Chairs scraped back. Conversations froze mid-sentence. And then there were the formal confrontations. A sheriff might step forward, voice calm but firm, announcing an arrest in a room that suddenly felt too small. Everyone instinctively shifted away from the centre. No one wanted to be in the line of fire. The saloon doors, once theatrical, became very real exit strategies. Gunfights inside saloons were not as graceful as legends suggest. Tables overturned, glass shattered, smoke mixed with gunpowder. The piano stopped abruptly. When it was over, someone always paid, in blood, in reputation, or in legal trouble the next morning. Yet the next night, the doors would swing open again. Because on the frontier, even enemies needed somewhere to sit down. Not every conflict in a saloon ended in gunfire. Sometimes it ended in furniture. The barroom brawl was almost a cultural tradition. Less premeditated violence, more spontaneous group activity. It usually began with something small, a spilled drink, a comment about someone's horse, a joke that landed slightly off target. Add whiskey, subtract patience, and suddenly the room shifted. It often started with a shove. Chairs scraped. One man stood too quickly, another stood faster. Words were exchanged, none of them improving the situation. The piano girl, sensing disaster, might try to play louder. It rarely helped. The first punch was always decisive. Once it landed, restraint left the building. Tables flipped, cards scattered like startled birds. Someone grabbed a bottle, sometimes to swing, sometimes to defend. Boots slipped in sawdust that had absorbed more than it was ever designed to. The bartender ducked behind the counter, protecting the cash drawer with the instinct of a seasoned survivor. Unlike gunfights, brawls were communal. If you were nearby, you were involved. A man trying to separate fighters might receive an elbow for his trouble. Another, entirely uninvolved, might catch a flying chair simply because he chose the wrong seat that evening. And yet, there was a strange etiquette to it. Weapons were often avoided. Revolvers remained holstered unless things escalated dramatically. Most men preferred fists, perhaps a boot, occasionally a bar stool. The goal was humiliation, not homicide. Eventually, exhaustion replaced anger. Breathing grew heavy, faces swelled, hats disappeared under tables. Someone laughed, usually the one who had started it, and now regretted everything. The bartender re-emerged cautiously, surveying broken glass and overturned furniture with the expression of a man calculating repair costs. Outside, onlookers pretended they had not been watching through the windows. By morning, bruised participants might share a drink again. Apologies were rare, but mutual understanding was common. Frontier life was hard enough without permanent enemies over a misplaced insult. The saloon absorbed it all: spilled whiskey, cracked chairs, wounded pride. And by nightfall, the doors would swing open again, as if nothing had happened at all. Eventually, even the wildest saloon had to quiet down, not because the men were suddenly disciplined, but because exhaustion always wins. By the final hour, the piano slowed to softer tunes. The laughter thinned. Cards were gathered, though debts were not always settled. A few stubborn drinkers clung to the bar, insisting they were perfectly steady while swaying like ships in rough water. The bartender became a different man at closing time. Earlier, he had been friendly, attentive, perhaps even amused. Now he was firm, calm but unmovable. He wiped down the bar with slow, deliberate strokes, signalling that the night was over whether anyone agreed or not. Tabs were tallied. Coins clinked. IOUs were noted carefully in a small ledger that carried more weight than it appeared. Some men left in groups, arms slung over shoulders, arguing about nothing important. Others stepped out alone into the cold frontier night, the noise of the saloon replaced instantly by wind and silence. That contrast was always striking. Inside, heat, smoke, human chaos. Outside, darkness stretching endlessly, stars sharp against the sky, the town little more than a cluster of wooden shapes. For many, stepping out of the saloon meant returning to harsh realities. A drafty boarding room, a tent near the mines, a bedroll under open sky. The warmth of the bar did not follow them home. And yet, the saloon lights remained for a little while longer. The bartender swept sawdust into uneven piles. Broken glass was collected. Tables were set upright again. Spittoons were emptied, an unpleasant but necessary ritual. By morning, the place would look almost respectable. Almost. The saloon was more than noise and violence. It was a refuge, flawed and chaotic, but dependable. In towns that appeared and disappeared with gold strikes and cattle routes, the saloon often outlasted everything else. Tomorrow, the doors would swing open again. The piano would start up. Deals would be made. Fights would erupt. Whiskey would burn. Because on the frontier, civilization was fragile. But the saloon endured. Charles Dickens entered the world in 1812 in Portsmouth, the second of 8 children in a family that lived perpetually on the edge of comfort. His father, John Dickens, worked as a clerk in the Navy Pay Office, respectable, educated, charming, and catastrophically irresponsible with money. He loved books, conversation, and the idea of living well. Unfortunately, he loved spending even more. For a time, young Charles experienced a childhood touched by imagination. He read voraciously. He adored stories of adventure and satire. He observed people closely, their mannerisms, their speech, their absurdities. That instinct to watch and remember would later become his greatest weapon as a novelist. But comfort proved fragile. John Dickens borrowed beyond his means, confident that luck or promotion would rescue him. It did not. In 1824, when Charles was just 12, the family's financial illusions collapsed. John was arrested and sent to Marshalsea debtors' prison. In Victorian England, imprisonment for debt was both common and cruel. A man's inability to pay did not just confine him, it stained his entire family. Charles did not join his father in prison, but the experience reshaped his life just as violently. He was pulled from school and sent to work in Warren's blacking factory, pasting labels on bottles of shoe polish. The pay was small, the hours were long, the humiliation was enormous. The boy who had once imagined heroic tales now stood in a rat-infested warehouse, surrounded by other children whose futures had already narrowed. What wounded him most was not just the labour, it was the sense of abandonment. He felt forgotten, disposable. His mother even suggested he remain at the factory permanently, a proposal that cut deeper than poverty itself. The experience carved something permanent into him. He learned what it felt like to fall. He saw how easily society discarded the vulnerable. He understood, in a way few writers ever truly do, the quiet despair of children forced into adult burdens. When his father was eventually released and Charles returned to school, the factory remained with him. Not physically, but psychologically. The shame never fully faded. Decades later, that wounded 12-year-old would reappear in his novels, disguised as Oliver Twist, David Copperfield, and countless other children navigating a world that seemed designed to forget them. If the blacking factory broke something inside Charles Dickens, it also hardened something. After his father's release from prison, Charles returned to school, but he was no longer the carefree child he had been. He had seen too much. He had worked among abandoned boys and endured the quiet humiliation of poverty. Education was no longer simply instruction. It was escape. By his mid-teens, Dickens left formal schooling and began working as a clerk in a law office. It was not glamorous, but it was instructive. He observed the machinery of bureaucracy, the endless paperwork, the rigid hierarchies, the slow grind of legal systems that often favoured procedure over justice. These impressions would later resurface in biting depictions of institutional absurdity. But Dickens was restless. He taught himself shorthand, a skill that demanded precision and speed. It was an ambitious move. Mastering shorthand opened the door to work as a court reporter, and soon he found himself sitting in legal galleries, recording trials word for word. He listened carefully. He studied speech patterns, regional accents, social mannerisms. Every witness, every lawyer, every nervous defendant became part of a mental archive. This was his informal university. Reporting eventually led him into journalism. By the 1830s, Dickens was writing parliamentary reports and newspaper sketches. London became his classroom. He walked its streets relentlessly, observing markets, alleyways, slums, theatres, taverns. He absorbed the rhythms of the city, the clatter of carriage wheels, the cries of vendors, the quiet desperation of factory labourers. And he began to write about it. His early pieces, published under the pseudonym Boz, were humorous sketches of urban life. They captured ordinary people with warmth and wit, but beneath the comedy lingered something sharper: awareness of inequality, absurdity, and quiet suffering. Readers noticed. In 1836, Dickens's serialized work, The Pickwick Papers, became an unexpected sensation. What began as a modest project exploded into national popularity. Installments sold in massive numbers. His name, once unknown, now circulated widely across England. He was only in his 20s. The boy who once pasted labels in a warehouse was now climbing rapidly into literary fame. Yet the factory never left him. Success did not erase memory. Instead, it sharpened his purpose. Dickens was not simply writing to entertain. He was writing to expose, to humanize, to remember what others preferred to ignore. By the late 1830s, Charles Dickens was no longer just a promising journalist. He was a national obsession. The success of the Pickwick Papers had changed everything. Originally conceived as a light-hearted series of comic adventures, the novel's serialized format created something new: anticipation. Readers waited anxiously for each installment. Crowds gathered at docks when shipments arrived, desperate to know what would happen next. Dickens had stumbled upon a powerful formula: fiction delivered in monthly parts, each ending with enough tension to keep the public hungry. He understood something instinctively about storytelling and human psychology: leave them wanting more. But Dickens did not remain content with light comedy. Fame gave him reach, and reach gave him responsibility. He began turning his attention toward darker subjects: poverty, child labour, crime, and the cruel absurdities of Victorian institutions. In 1837, he published Oliver Twist, a novel that shocked polite society. Instead of romanticising London, Dickens exposed its underbelly: workhouses, criminal gangs, starving children navigating a city that offered little mercy. Oliver's simple plea, "Please, sir, I want some more," became more than dialogue. It became accusation. Dickens had done something bold. He made the poor visible. Soon followed Nicholas Nickleby attacking abusive boarding schools and The Old Curiosity Shop, which stirred readers to tears with the fate of little Nell. His characters felt alive. They were exaggerated, yes, sometimes theatrical, sometimes grotesque, but they breathed. Readers laughed with them, feared for them, mourned them. And Dickens wrote relentlessly. He maintained a punishing schedule, editing journals, writing novels in installments, attending social events, managing finances. He seemed powered by nervous energy, rarely still, rarely silent. But success brought pressure. Each new work had to surpass the last. Each character had to feel unforgettable. The public expected not just entertainment, but emotional investment. Dickens delivered with A Christmas Carol in 1843, a short but potent moral tale that blended ghost story with social critique. Ebenezer Scrooge entered cultural memory permanently, and Dickens proved he could combine warmth, redemption, and social commentary in a single stroke. By his 30s, Charles Dickens was not merely a writer. He was the voice of Victorian England, chronicling its ambition, exposing its cruelty, and shaping how it saw itself. As Dickens matured, so did his anger. Victorian England was proud of its progress. Railways slicing across countryside, factories roaring with industry, cities expanding at unprecedented speed. It was an age of invention and empire, but Dickens looked past the shining surface and saw something darker grinding beneath it. Industrialization created wealth, yes, but it also created suffering on an industrial scale. Children worked in factories for endless hours. Families crammed into slums where disease spread faster than opportunity. Debtors rotted in prison while financiers dined comfortably. Workhouses claimed to offer relief, but often delivered humiliation instead. Dickens did not learn these realities from reports alone. He had lived on the edge of them. He had seen how fragile security could be. His novels sharpened. In Bleak House, he attacked the legal system, particularly the endless case of Jarndyce and Jarndyce, a fictional lawsuit that drags on for generations, consuming fortunes and lives. Dickens exposed how bureaucracy, when left unchecked, becomes its own cruel machine. In Hard Times, he turned his gaze toward industrial towns, where factories dominated landscapes and logic dominated classrooms. The character of Thomas Gradgrind embodied a philosophy of cold rationalism, facts over feeling, numbers over humanity. Dickens questioned whether a society obsessed with profit and efficiency could truly nourish the human spirit. And then came Little Dorrit, a novel haunted by debt and imprisonment, echoing Dickens's own childhood trauma. The Marshalsea prison reappeared in fiction, transformed into a symbol of systemic cruelty. Dickens was not merely recounting history, he was revisiting wounds. Yet his critique was rarely abstract. He personalised injustice. He gave it faces: orphaned children, crushed clerks, forgotten women, corrupt officials. Each character carried social commentary within their story. Dickens understood that readers might ignore statistics, but they would not ignore a child they had grown to love over hundreds of pages. His tone oscillated between humour and outrage. He could caricature a villain with theatrical flair, then pivot into devastating emotional realism. That balance kept readers engaged while quietly confronting them with uncomfortable truths. Dickens was not a politician. He held no office. But through serialized fiction, he reached deeper into public consciousness than many reformers ever could. The fog of London, the smoke of factories, the clatter of progress. He captured it all, and he insisted that progress without compassion was not progress at all. By the 1840s and 50s, Charles Dickens was not simply admired, he was celebrated. His readings sold out. His novels circulated across Britain, Europe, and America. He dined with intellectuals, politicians, actors. He had achieved what few writers of his era ever managed: financial success alongside cultural dominance. But success did not bring peace. Dickens married Catherine Hogarth in 1836. Together they had 10 children. At first, the marriage appeared stable, a proper Victorian household with growing fame attached to it. Yet behind the public image, strain accumulated. Dickens was restless, energetic to the point of compulsion. He walked miles through London at night, unable to quiet his thoughts. He threw himself into work relentlessly, juggling novels, journalism, editorial duties, and public appearances. He expected discipline from himself and from others. Over time, the marriage deteriorated. Catherine struggled under the pressure of constant pregnancies and the shadow of her husband's rising celebrity. Dickens, increasingly dissatisfied, grew emotionally distant. By 1858, the couple formally separated, a scandalous move in Victorian society. The separation damaged reputations and fractured the family. Dickens managed the narrative carefully, defending his image publicly while distancing himself privately. Letters were destroyed. Explanations were vague. Speculation lingered. Around this time, he formed a close relationship with a young actress, Ellen Ternan. The nature of their relationship remains debated, but it added further complexity to Dickens's personal life. For a man who championed domestic virtue in his fiction, his private life became quietly controversial. Yet professionally, he thrived. He began performing public readings of his own works, dramatic, emotional, almost theatrical performances that drew enormous crowds. Dickens did not simply read, he acted. He embodied his characters. Audiences laughed and wept as if attending a stage production. The tours, however, were exhausting. He pushed himself physically, ignoring warning signs. His health began to decline, though he refused to slow down. Behind the beloved novelist stood a man increasingly divided, generous yet controlling, compassionate yet severe, deeply sensitive yet fiercely ambitious. Dickens had spent his career exposing the fractures of society. Now, his own life mirrored that complexity. By the 1850s, Charles Dickens had discovered something dangerous about himself. He loved the stage, not in the quiet, scholarly way one might expect from a novelist, but with the intensity of a born performer. When he began giving public readings of his works, he did not simply stand behind a podium and recite text. He transformed. He rehearsed obsessively. He edited his novels into dramatic scripts tailored for live performance. He practiced gestures, facial expressions, pacing. When he stepped onto the stage, he became Scrooge. He became Fagin. He became the frightened child or the furious creditor. His voice shifted effortlessly between characters. Audiences were mesmerized, Victorian readers had adored him in print. Now they saw him breathe life into the very people they had imagined. The halls were packed. Crowds lined up hours before doors opened. Newspapers covered his tours like national events. In Britain and later in America, Dickens became a literary celebrity in the modern sense. Recognisable, celebrated, almost mythic. But the tours demanded everything. He travelled constantly by train and carriage, often in harsh weather. He performed multiple times a week. Each reading required emotional intensity. Scenes of grief or terror were not recited casually. Dickens poured himself into them. At times, he left the stage visibly shaken, pale, drenched in sweat. Friends warned him. His health had already begun to falter. He suffered from exhaustion, nervous strain, and bouts of physical weakness. Yet he ignored advice to rest. The applause fueled him. The connection with audiences was intoxicating. Perhaps the boy who once felt abandoned in a factory found something healing in the adoration of thousands. Yet there was irony in it. Dickens wrote fiercely about the dangers of overwork, about systems that consumed human energy without mercy. And still, he drove himself relentlessly. On stage, he seemed unstoppable, commanding, charismatic, in total control. Offstage, he grew thinner, more fragile, more worn. By the late 1860s, the strain was undeniable. Minor strokes and health scares forced temporary pauses, but even then, he planned returns. He had spent his life animating suffering and injustice for others to see. Now his own body quietly signalled its limits. Limits he refused to fully accept. By the late 1860s, Charles Dickens was a man racing against something he refused to name. His health had grown visibly fragile. He suffered from dizziness, exhaustion, and warning signs that modern medicine would recognize as serious. Minor strokes had weakened him. Doctors advised rest. Friends urged caution. Dickens agreed, briefly, but he could not detach from work. He was in the middle of writing The Mystery of Edwin Drood, a novel darker and more psychologically complex than many of his earlier works. It revolved around obsession, guilt, and disappearance, themes that now feel hauntingly appropriate. Even as his body faltered, his mind remained active. He continued writing, editing, planning. On June 9th, 1870, at his home in Kent, Dickens collapsed after a full day of work. He never regained consciousness. The following day, at the age of 58, Charles Dickens died of a stroke. The reaction was immediate and immense. News spread across Britain and beyond. Crowds gathered outside his home. Newspapers filled columns with tributes. For many readers, it felt personal. Dickens had not simply entertained them. He had walked beside them through grief, poverty, injustice, and redemption. His death left Edwin Drood unfinished, a mystery that would remain unsolved, debated for generations. There had been discussion of a modest burial in Rochester Cathedral, near his beloved Kent countryside. But the nation decided otherwise. Dickens was buried in Westminster Abbey's Poets' Corner, among literary giants. It was a symbolic act. The boy who once laboured in a blacking factory had become part of England's cultural foundation. Yet even in death, Dickens remained complex. He had been a fierce advocate for the poor, yet personally demanding. Compassionate in fiction, often stern in private life. Warm in public readings, controlled in family matters. His contradictions mirrored the very society he chronicled. Still, his influence endured. Factories modernised. Laws evolved. Social reformers found inspiration in the empathy his novels generated. Characters like Oliver Twist, Ebenezer Scrooge, and David Copperfield entered global consciousness. Charles Dickens had given voice to fog-choked streets, forgotten children, and struggling clerks. And in doing so, he ensured they would never be forgotten again. Death did not quiet Charles Dickens. If anything, it amplified him. In the decades following his passing, his novels continued to circulate at astonishing speed. Industrial printing ensured that new generations encountered Oliver Twist asking for more, Scrooge confronting his ghosts, and Pip navigating the illusions of great expectations. Dickens's characters escaped the boundaries of page and era. They became cultural archetypes. He had written about Victorian England, but he had also written about something timeless. Vulnerability. The orphan, the debtor, the neglected child, the overworked clerk, the corrupt official. These figures did not disappear with the 19th century. They simply changed clothing. That universality ensured his relevance far beyond his own lifetime. Academics debated his structure and sentimentality. Critics sometimes accused him of exaggeration, of caricature, of emotional manipulation. And yet, readers kept turning pages. The laughter was infectious. The sorrow felt earned. His theatrical style, once considered excessive by some contemporaries, proved durable. More importantly, Dickens influenced reform. His exposure of workhouses, debtor prisons, and child labour did not single-handedly transform Victorian society, but it stirred conscience. Readers who might never step inside a slum were forced to imagine one vividly. Sympathy became political pressure. Public awareness grew sharper. He also shaped the very form of the novel. Serialization, cliffhangers, sprawling casts of characters, intertwining subplots. Dickens mastered pacing in a way that modern television writers might quietly admire. He understood rhythm. He understood anticipation. He knew when to devastate and when to redeem. And then there is Christmas. A Christmas Carol alone reshaped cultural imagination of the holiday, blending morality, generosity, and festive warmth. Scrooge's transformation became shorthand for personal redemption. Few writers managed to influence both literature and seasonal tradition. Statues rose, streets bore his name, adaptations multiplied, stage, film, radio, television. Each era reinterpreted him, yet the core remained recognizable. The child who once feared obscurity achieved the opposite. He became unavoidable. Charles Dickens wrote in ink, but he carved in memory. And memory, when attached to empathy, endures longer than marble. By now, Charles Dickens feels almost untouchable, a monument in ink, safely positioned among literary giants. But monuments smooth out edges. The real man was far more complicated. He was generous, often privately donating to causes and helping struggling writers. He was also controlling, particularly within his family. He demanded discipline from his children, yet did not always offer emotional warmth in return. He could write tenderly about abandoned children while remaining distant from his own. He despised injustice with genuine passion. Yet he carefully managed his public image, especially during his separation from Catherine. Letters were destroyed. Narratives were shaped. Reputation mattered deeply to him. In many ways, Dickens embodied Victorian contradiction. He celebrated domestic virtue in fiction while navigating personal scandal. He exposed the cruelty of institutions, yet maintained rigid expectations at home. He was sentimental and satirical, theatrical and analytical, deeply empathetic, yet fiercely ambitious. And perhaps that complexity is what makes him enduring. His characters were rarely perfect. Heroes stumbled. Villains sometimes possessed traces of humanity. Redemption was possible, but not guaranteed. Dickens understood that people are layered, capable of compassion and cruelty in the same lifetime. The little boy who felt humiliated in the blacking factory never fully disappeared. He became the emotional engine of Dickens's writing. That early wound fueled both empathy and ambition. He wanted success, not merely to rise, but to ensure he would never fall again. Yet the very drive that propelled him to greatness also exhausted him. When we read Dickens today, we often encounter the grand storyteller first, the vivid caricatures, the dramatic plots, the humour. But beneath it all is a deeply personal current: fear of obscurity, anger at injustice, hunger for recognition, longing for connection. He did not write from a safe distance. He wrote from memory. Charles Dickens left behind more than novels. He left behind a way of seeing, one that insists society must be judged not by its wealth, but by how it treats its most vulnerable. The fog of Victorian England has long since lifted, but his vision remains startlingly clear. Before empires built temples, triumphal arches, or palaces of marble, they faced a far simpler question. Where will the water come from? A settlement can survive without ornament. It cannot survive without water. Early cities were born beside rivers for this reason. The Nile, the Tigris and Euphrates, the Indus. These were not just geographic features, they were arteries of life. But as populations grew, proximity was no longer enough. Wells dried under pressure. Springs became insufficient. Rivers, once generous, could not stretch infinitely to meet expanding demand. Growth created crisis. Imagine a city swelling beyond its original footprint. Houses multiply. Workshops appear. Public baths become essential. Fields outside the walls demand irrigation. Suddenly the nearest source is too far, too low, or too unreliable. Without intervention, thirst would choke ambition. Ancient engineers responded with something extraordinary. They decided to move the water, not by buckets, not by carts, but by gravity. The principle sounds simple. Find a higher source, channel it downhill, let nature do the work. But simplicity on paper hides enormous difficulty in execution. The slope had to be calculated with astonishing precision. Too steep, and the water would rush violently, damaging the structure. Too shallow, and it would stagnate or fail to flow at all. Over long distances, even minor miscalculations would compound into disaster. Surveyors walked landscapes with measuring rods and sighting tools, studying hills and valleys with patient intensity. Builders carved channels into stone. They dug tunnels through rock. They constructed elevated arcades to cross low ground. Every decision balanced physics and geography. This was not decorative architecture. It was survival architecture. A city with steady water could expand confidently. It could sustain public baths, fountains, workshops, and agriculture. It could support population density without collapse. Water meant hygiene, productivity, stability. And remarkably, this innovation appeared across multiple civilizations. From Mediterranean basins to arid plateaus and mountainous highlands, societies confronted the same challenge and arrived at similar solutions. They refused to remain limited by landscape. Instead, they reshaped it. The aqueduct was not merely a structure of stone. It was a declaration. Civilization would not wait for nature's convenience. It would engineer its own continuity. If any civilization perfected the aqueduct, it was Rome. The Romans did not invent the concept of moving water over long distances, but they refined it with relentless ambition. As the city of Rome expanded from a modest settlement into a sprawling imperial capital, its thirst became immense. Wells in the Tiber River were no longer sufficient. The population demanded more, and Rome answered with stone, precision, and scale. The first major Roman aqueduct, the Aqua Appia, was constructed in the 4th century before Christ. It ran mostly underground, protecting the water from contamination and enemy attack. It was practical, modest, and revolutionary. But Rome rarely stopped at modest. Over time, more aqueducts followed, each stretching farther, reaching higher, crossing more dramatic terrain. Engineers built arcades of stacked arches that carried water across valleys. These were not purely aesthetic choices. Arches distributed weight efficiently, allowing structures to remain stable over long distances. Yet the result was undeniably monumental. The skyline itself began to display Rome's control over water. The secret was slope. Roman aqueducts maintained an incredibly slight downward gradient, often just a few feet over miles. Surveyors used specialized tools like the chorobates to measure alignment with impressive accuracy. Without pumps or engines, gravity did all the work. Water flowed continuously, day and night, from distant springs into the heart of the city. And what did Rome do with this abundance? Public fountains spilled constantly into streets. Grand bath complexes offered heated pools, steam rooms, and cold plunges. Private households of the wealthy enjoyed indoor plumbing. Even latrines benefited from steady flow, flushing waste into sewage systems. Water became a symbol of Roman order. It also became propaganda. An aqueduct visible on the horizon was not merely infrastructure. It was proof of imperial competence. It told citizens and visitors alike that Rome could command nature itself. Maintenance was constant. Workers inspected channels, cleared mineral buildup, repaired cracks. The system was not invincible, but its durability was remarkable. Some aqueducts functioned for centuries. In mastering gravity, Rome mastered something deeper: permanence. Water flowed, the city thrived, and stone arches stretching across landscapes became silent declarations of power, a civilization sustained by precision, discipline, and flowing spring water. While Rome built arches that marched proudly across valleys, Persia chose a different strategy. They went underground. In the arid landscapes of ancient Iran and surrounding regions, surface water was unreliable. Rivers were seasonal. Evaporation was relentless. Building elevated channels in extreme heat risked losing precious flow before it reached its destination. So Persian engineers developed a solution both subtle and brilliant: the qanat. A qanat was not a towering structure visible from miles away. It was a gently sloping tunnel dug beneath the earth, tapping into underground aquifers and channeling water across long distances without exposing it to the sun. Vertical shafts, spaced at regular intervals, allowed workers to excavate and maintain the tunnel. From above, these shafts formed a line of circular openings stretching across desert landscapes like a dotted path. Beneath them, water moved quietly. The genius of the qanat was protection. By keeping the channel underground, evaporation was minimized. The water remained cool. It traveled steadily, guided by gravity, emerging far from its original source to irrigate fields, supply towns, and sustain life in environments that might otherwise remain barren. Constructing a qanat required immense planning and labor. Engineers had to identify suitable aquifers in foothills or mountains. They calculated slope with extraordinary care. Too steep, and the tunnel risked collapse. Too shallow, and water would not flow. Digging through rock and soil without modern equipment demanded precision and endurance. But the reward was transformative. Entire settlements flourished in regions that appeared inhospitable. Crops grew in carefully irrigated fields. Gardens thrived. Urban centers developed where none should have existed. Water shaped not just survival, but culture. Unlike Rome's aqueducts, which broadcast imperial might, qanats operated almost invisibly. Their presence was known through the life they enabled rather than the stone they displayed, and their longevity is remarkable. Some qanat systems have functioned for centuries, even millennia, maintained generation after generation. Knowledge passed through communities like a living inheritance. In Persia, engineering did not shout. It whispered beneath the earth, carving hidden rivers through desert soil, proof that mastery over water did not require spectacle, only understanding of terrain, patience, and gravity's quiet pull. Long before Rome's aqueducts dominated horizons, Greek engineers were already experimenting with controlled water systems, blending mathematics, observation, and bold imagination. Greek cities often relied on springs and wells, but as urban populations expanded, especially in places like Athens and Samos, more complex solutions emerged. The Greeks approached water engineering with the same mindset they applied to philosophy and geometry: measured, rational, deliberate. One of the most astonishing examples is the tunnel of Eupalinos on the island of Samos. Built in the 6th century before Christ, this tunnel was not simply carved from one end. It was excavated simultaneously from both sides of a mountain, and the two teams met in the middle with remarkable accuracy. Without modern instruments, using only geometric calculations and sighting tools, engineers achieved alignment across solid rock. It was an extraordinary act of applied mathematics. The tunnel carried water from a spring to the city, safely hidden underground to protect it from enemies. In times of war, visible aqueducts could be sabotaged. Hidden channels offered security. Greek engineers understood that water was strategic as well as practical. Beyond tunnels, Greek cities constructed stone channels and clay pipe networks to distribute water within urban spaces. Fountains became civic features, gathering points where citizens collected water daily. Access to clean water supported hygiene, agriculture, and social life. Unlike Rome's later grandeur, Greek systems often emphasized efficiency over monumentality. They were functional, carefully designed to adapt to rugged terrain. Engineers studied slope, rock composition, and flow patterns. Mathematics was not abstract theory, it was survival. The Greeks also understood maintenance. Channels were accessible for cleaning. Sediment was anticipated. Water systems were not temporary projects, but ongoing responsibilities. Their legacy lies not only in surviving structures, but in method. They proved that engineering could be guided by geometry, that calculation could shape mountains, and that water could be directed with intellect as much as labour. Where Persia mastered concealment and Rome mastered scale, Greece mastered precision. In rocky landscapes overlooking the Aegean Sea, engineers quietly demonstrated that knowledge itself could move rivers, not by force, but by careful alignment with nature's laws. If Rome perfected the aqueduct in Italy, Carthage demonstrated that the system could conquer harsh climates. Located in modern-day Tunisia, ancient Carthage stood in a region where rainfall was limited and summer heat relentless. Yet the city grew into a powerful Mediterranean hub, first under Punic control, later under Rome. Water, once again, determined survival. After Rome destroyed Carthage and later rebuilt it as a Roman colony, engineers constructed one of the longest aqueduct systems in the ancient world, the Aqueduct of Zagouan. Its source lay in springs high in the mountains, far from the coastal city. From there, water travelled across valleys and plains, sometimes underground, sometimes elevated on towering arcades of stone arches. The distance was immense. The terrain was unforgiving. Yet the system endured. The arches that still stand today stretch across North African landscapes like skeletal ribs of a forgotten giant. They carried water toward baths, fountains, and homes, sustaining urban life in a region where drought was a constant threat. What makes Carthage remarkable is adaptation. North Africa demanded resilience. Engineers had to consider extreme temperatures, seasonal shifts, and long stretches of exposed terrain. Materials were carefully selected. Mortar was mixed to withstand heat. Channels were sealed against leakage and mineral buildup. Water arriving in Carthage fed public baths, modelled after those in Rome, spaces of hygiene, leisure, and civic identity. The presence of abundant water signalled stability and prosperity. It reassured citizens that even in an arid climate, infrastructure could triumph over scarcity. But such systems required vigilance. Sandstorms, earthquakes, and political instability could interrupt maintenance. When authority weakened, aqueducts suffered. Without constant care, channels clogged, arches crumbled, and cities shrank. The aqueduct of Carthage illustrates a broader truth. Water systems are reflections of political strength. When governance is organized and resources are allocated, water flows. When stability falters, the channels decay. Still, the surviving arches stand today, weathered but enduring. They remind us that even in sun-scorched landscapes, ancient engineers refused to accept limitation. They reached into distant mountains and pulled life across the desert. Stone by stone, they extended civilization into dryness, proving that thirst could be answered with vision and gravity. Far from the Mediterranean and the deserts of Persia, another civilization confronted an entirely different challenge: altitude. High in the Andes Mountains, the Inca built cities in landscapes that seem almost vertical. Steep slopes, thin air, unpredictable rainfall. Nothing about this environment was easy. Yet the Inca did not merely survive there, they engineered it. Water in the Andes was not always scarce, but it was unstable. Heavy rains could trigger landslides, dry seasons could threaten crops. Mountain springs needed careful management. The solution was not a single monumental aqueduct stretching across valleys, but an intricate network of channels, terraces, and stone-lined conduits. At Machu Picchu, water flows through a sophisticated gravity-fed system that still functions today. Engineers tapped natural springs higher up the mountain, then directed water along carved channels, distributing it through a sequence of fountains descending step by step into the city. Each fountain overflowed gently into the next. The slope had to be exact. Too steep, and the water would erode the stone. Too shallow, and it would stagnate. Without iron tools or written engineering manuals, Inca builders achieved precision through observation and deep familiarity with their terrain. Terracing was equally critical. Agricultural terraces carved into mountainsides were not only for crops, they also managed water runoff. Carefully layered soil and stone allowed rain to filter gradually rather than rushing downhill destructively. Drainage systems were integrated invisibly into the landscape. Unlike Rome's towering arches, Inca water systems blended into their environment. Stone channels followed natural contours. Fountains felt like extensions of the mountain itself. Engineering and nature were not in opposition, they were interwoven. Water held spiritual meaning as well. Springs were sacred. Flowing water symbolized life and divine presence. Infrastructure was therefore both practical and ceremonial. Maintaining water was not just maintenance, it was stewardship. In the Andes, engineers did not seek to dominate dramatic landscapes. They sought harmony with them. High above sea level, where clouds drift at eye level and cliffs drop steeply below, water still runs through channels carved centuries ago. Gravity remains the silent partner. And in that partnership between mountain and mason, civilization found its footing at the edge of the sky. While Rome stretched arches across valleys and the Inca carved channels into mountains, ancient China approached water with a different scale of ambition. Not just city supply, regional transformation. China's early civilizations were shaped by rivers, especially the Yellow River, powerful and unpredictable. It nourished fields, but also flooded catastrophically. Managing water in China meant controlling excess as much as distributing scarcity. One of the most extraordinary examples is the Dujiangyan irrigation system, built in the 3rd century before Christ in Sichuan. Rather than constructing a massive dam, engineers designed a diversion system that split the Min River into channels. One branch reduced flood risk, the other directed water toward agricultural plains. It was subtle brilliance. The system used natural topography, stone levees, and precisely positioned weirs to regulate flow seasonally. During heavy rains, excess water could bypass farmland. During dry periods, irrigation remained steady. The design respected the river's force instead of trying to overpower it. Further east, canal systems expanded dramatically over centuries. By the time of later dynasties, interconnected waterways linked northern and southern China, facilitating not only irrigation, but transport of grain, goods, and troops. Water became infrastructure at the scale of empire. Unlike Roman aqueducts, which primarily delivered clean drinking water, Chinese systems often prioritized agriculture and flood management. Stable irrigation meant stable harvests. Stable harvests meant stable governance. The engineering was immense. Channels were excavated across plains. Embankments reinforced riverbanks. Spillways controlled seasonal surges. Maintenance was constant and organized at state level. Water management was a political act. In China, control over water symbolized control over nature and legitimacy of rule. A ruler who failed to manage floods risked rebellion. A ruler who ensured irrigation secured loyalty. These systems required coordination across vast territories. Labor forces numbered in the thousands. Knowledge passed through generations of engineers and officials. Water in China was not just local necessity. It was imperial strategy. From mountain diversion systems to grand canal networks, ancient Chinese engineers demonstrated that moving water could unite regions, feed millions, and stabilized dynasties, not with arches that dominated skylines, but with channels that quietly shaped the fate of empires. By now, it is clear that ancient engineers understood slope, but what happened when the land refused to cooperate? What if a valley dipped too sharply for a gentle gradient? What if a river gorge interrupted a carefully planned channel? What if a mountain stood directly between the source and the city? This is where aqueduct engineering became truly inventive. One solution was tunneling. Rather than climbing over obstacles, builders sometimes carved directly through them. These tunnels required careful ventilation, lighting by torch, and alignment from both ends. Miscalculation could mean two digging teams missing each other entirely, wasting labour and time. Yet across Greece, Rome, and Persia, tunnels were executed with astonishing accuracy. Another solution was the inverted siphon. Unlike modern siphons that rely on flexible tubes, ancient inverted siphons used sealed pipes, often made of stone, lead, or ceramic, to carry water down one side of a valley and back up the other. Gravity pulled the water downward, building pressure at the lowest point. That pressure forced the water to rise again on the opposite slope, as long as the outlet remained lower than the original source. This required understanding more than slope. It required understanding pressure. Pipes had to withstand immense force at the lowest points. If materials were weak, joints would burst. Engineers reinforced sections, selected durable stone, and sometimes used multiple parallel pipes to distribute stress. In places like Gaul and parts of the Roman Empire, siphon systems allowed aqueducts to cross dramatic landscapes without building impossibly tall arches. Maintenance grew more complicated. Sealed systems were harder to inspect. Mineral buildup could block flow. Repairs required skill and organization. But the payoff was continuity. Water uninterrupted by terrain. What makes these innovations remarkable is not just the physical labor involved, but the conceptual leap. Ancient engineers were not guessing blindly. They observed patterns. They experimented. They learned from failure. They recognized that water follows predictable laws. By aligning infrastructure with those laws, they extended reach beyond what simple channels allowed. Valleys were no longer barriers. Mountains were no longer endpoints. With tunnels beneath rock and siphons under pressure, ancient aqueducts became more than stone channels. They became demonstrations of applied science, long before science had a formal name. Aqueducts feel eternal when they are flowing, but their true story is revealed when they fall silent. Every ancient water system, no matter how brilliant, depended on maintenance. Channels accumulated mineral deposits. Roots intruded into tunnels. Earthquakes cracked arches. Floods damaged embankments. Without constant care, even the most precise slope meant nothing, and maintenance required stability. In Rome, teams of workers inspected aqueducts regularly. Officials oversaw repairs. Laws protected water sources from contamination. The system was bureaucratic as well as architectural. When governance functioned, water flowed. But when empires fractured, so did infrastructure. As Roman authority weakened in the West, maintenance declined. Invasions disrupted oversight. Local resources were stretched thin. Some aqueducts were intentionally cut during sieges to deny cities access to water. Others simply decayed through neglect. Stone arches remained, but water no longer moved through them. Cities shrank. Public baths closed. Fountains ran dry. Urban populations declined dramatically in some regions because reliable water systems could not be sustained. Civilization's rhythm slowed when gravity no longer delivered its steady gift. The pattern repeated elsewhere. In arid regions, abandoned qanats filled with sediment when communities dispersed. In the Andes, agricultural terraces eroded without continual repair. In China, neglected embankments allowed floods to reclaim plains. Water systems were living systems. They demanded attention, cooperation, and shared responsibility. When societies invested in them, they flourished. When they faltered politically or economically, infrastructure followed. And yet, many survived astonishingly long. Some Roman aqueducts operated for centuries. Persian qanats still function today. The Dujangyan system in China continues to regulate water. In the Andes, channels carved by the Inca still carry flow during rainy seasons. The endurance is humbling. Aqueducts remind us that civilization is not only about conquest, monuments, or grand narratives. It is about the quiet, continuous management of essentials. Water does not care about ideology. It obeys gravity. The ancient world understood this deeply. Through arches, tunnels, siphons, and underground rivers, engineers reshaped landscapes to sustain life. Their systems were not glamorous once built. They were constant. And when they stopped, so did something far larger than infrastructure. They were veins of empire. And every empire eventually must reckon with its thirst.